story of David is a Sinanat epic. A story about a kid who was overlooked by his own family. A teenager who faced down a literal giant. A young man who lived as a fugitive in caves. And a king who reached the top only to nearly lose it all because of his own massive mistakes. David wasn't a perfect person. In fact, he was deeply flawed. But the sources tell us he was a man after God's own heart. This doesn't mean he never messed up. It means that no matter how far he fell, his heart always returned to the only one who could pick him up. The story starts in a small town called Bethlehem around 1030 BC. David was the youngest of 8 brothers. And in his family, he was basically given the lowest job available, caring for the sheep. While his older brothers were being trained as valiant warriors, David was out in the fields, pulling double shifts, protecting the flock from predators. He wasn't just sitting around, though. He was learning responsibility, courage, and patience in isolation. He spent his time privately fighting off lions and bears with nothing but a sling in his bare hands. And he practiced his harp, writing the songs we now find in the Book of Psalms. One day, the famous prophet Samuel showed up at their house. God had told Samuel to find a new king because the current king, Saul, was failing due to his constant disobedience. David's dad, Jesse, brought out all the impressive older brothers, the ones who were tall, athletic, and looked like they belonged on a billboard. Samuel thought for sure the oldest, Eliab, was the guy, but God gave him a piece of advice that everyone should remember. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. David wasn't even invited to the meeting. His family had almost forgotten him out in the fields. When they finally dragged him in, God told Samuel, "Arise, anoint him, for this is he." Samuel poured oil over David's head from a horn, a ritual that signified David was the future king. And then David went right back to the sheep. He had a destiny, but he had to wait in the silence of the wilderness for years before he ever saw a throne. Eventually, David's musical skills got him a gig at the royal palace. King Saul was being tormented by an evil spirit, and David's harp music was the only thing that brought him relief. He unknowingly put the person God had chosen to replace him right in his own court. Not long after, a massive war broke out with a rival nation called the Philistines. They had a champion named Goliath who was nearly 10 feet tall, wore armor that weighed more than an average person, and carried a spear the size of a fence post. For 40 days, Goliath stood in the valley and mocked the Israelite army and their God. But King Saul and his soldiers were too terrified to move. David showed up at the front lines just to bring lunch to his brothers. When he heard the giant's trash talk, he didn't feel fear. He felt insulted that anyone would mock the armies of the living God. Even though his oldest brother tried to shut him down and King Saul told him he was just a youth, David volunteered to fight. Saul tried to put his own heavy armor on David, but the kid couldn't even walk in it because he hadn't proved it. Instead, he grabbed 5 smooth stones from a brook and his trusty sling. As he ran toward the giant, he didn't rely on muscle. He relied on faith, shouting that the battle belonged to the Lord. 1 stone to the forehead, and the giant was down. Overnight, David went from a nobody shepherd to the most famous hero in the country. Success, however, brings haters. King Saul grew incredibly jealous of David, especially when he heard the women in town singing a song that went, "Saul has slain his thousands, and David his tens of thousands." Saul spent the next decade trying to assassinate David, once even throwing a javelin at him while David was playing music for him. David went from hero to fugitive, running for his life through 18 different locations. He lived in caves like Adullam and was eventually so desperate, he sought refuge in the Philistine city of Gath, the home of Goliath. To survive here, he had to pretend to be a madman, drooling on his beard and scratching at the gates just to convince the Philistine king he wasn't a threat. This is the part of the story where David really grew up. Twice he had the chance to kill Saul and end the hunt, but he refused to do it because he respected the authority God had given Saul. He realized that the waiting season wasn't a punishment, it was a training ground. He learned that true strength is found in trusting God when everything seems lost. Like when his temporary home in Ziklag was burned down by enemies and his own men wanted to stone him. Instead of giving up, David encouraged himself in the Lord and led a mission to recover everything that was stolen. Finally, after Saul died in a battle where he fell on his own sword, David was positioned to lead. Despite Saul's hatred, David didn't celebrate. He wept and mourned for the king and his best friend Jonathan. At age 30, David became king, first over his own tribe, Judah, for 7 years, and then eventually over all of Israel around 2003 BC. One of his first major moves was capturing a fortress called Jerusalem from the Jebusites. The people living there mocked him, saying even the blind and the lame could defend the city. But David's team climbed up through a hidden water shaft and took it over. Jerusalem became the capital, the city of David. David wasn't just a politician, he was a worshiper. He brought the Ark of the Covenant, a sacred chest representing God's presence, into Jerusalem with a massive parade. David was so happy that he danced in the streets with all his might, not caring if he looked unpingly to his wife or the public. He wanted everyone to know that his leadership started with worshiping God. God was so pleased that he made a covenant with David, promising that his royal line would last forever, a promise that eventually led to Jesus. If David's story ended there, it would be a perfect fairy tale. But David was human, and he succumbed to the temptation of abusing his power. One spring, when he should have been out leading his army, he stayed home and got lazy. He saw a woman named Bathsheba bathing from his rooftop and took her for himself. When she became pregnant, David tried a massive cover-up by bringing her husband, Uriah, home from the war, hoping he'd sleep with his wife so everyone would think the baby was his. But Uriah was a man of integrity and refused to relax while his buddies were on the battlefield. Desperate, David sent a secret letter to his general, ordering them to put Uriah in the most dangerous part of the fight, and then pull everyone back so he would be killed. David thought he got away with it until the prophet Nathan showed up. Nathan told him a story about a rich man who stole a poor man's only pet lamb, and David was furious until Nathan pointed a finger and said, "Thou art the man." David didn't make excuses or try to cancel the prophet. He fell on his knees and repented, writing the words we now find in Psalm 51. "Have Have mercy upon me, O God. Create in me a clean heart. God forgave him, but the choices David made broke something in his family that would haunt him for years. The consequences were brutal. His eldest son, Amnon, committed a crime against his sister, and David's other son, Absalom, eventually staged a coup and forced David to flee Jerusalem once again as a fugitive. It's a heart-wrenching scene, a father running for his life from the son he loved. The rebellion ended in a forest battle where Absalom's long hair got caught in a tree, leading to his death. Despite the victory, David didn't celebrate. He wept in the street, crying, "Oh, my son Absalom, would God I had died for thee." In his final years, David grew weak and even nearly died in a fight with another giant before his men rescued him. He spent his last days preparing his son Solomon to take over and collecting all the gold and materials Solomon would need to build a massive temple for God. David died at age 70 after 40 years on the throne. He left behind a kingdom that had gone from a divided group of tribes to a regional superpower. His biggest legacy wasn't just the territory, but the fact that he stayed faithful to his relationship with God through every high and low. We even have archaeological proof of his impact today. The Teldan Stele, an ancient stone found in 1993, explicitly mentions the House of David, showing that his dynasty was famous throughout the ancient world. You might think the Bible is hard to understand, but David's life is simple to grasp when you see it this way. God doesn't call the qualified, He qualifies the called. He saw a king and a shepherd boy, and He sees a purpose in you, even when you're just out in the fields of your daily life. David was a hero and a failure, a musician and a warrior, but he never stopped running back to God's mercy. No matter how many times he took a wrong turn or ignored the directions, the recalculating signal, which was God's mercy, always provided a path back home to the right destination, so long as he was willing to turn the wheel back toward the truth.